Welcome to the final panel of the 2022 Campaign and Election Series, focusing on political media. We're delighted to have two illustrious representatives of the Oklahoma media joining us today, Carmen Foreman from the Oklahoman and Reese Gorman of the Frontier. Before we get started, for one final time this semester, on behalf of Dr. Emily Stacy, I'd like to thank the amazing team from Event Services. That's Anita Poole-Inslee, Connie Myrick, John Shackelford, and their crew. Associate Dean James Davenport, who did a lot of work on this but could not, unfortunately, be with us today. And the incredible social sciences faculty who have been featured in this panel series. Dr. Batchhofer, who's with us again today. Dr. Boger, who is joining us as an observer today, and Professor Mary Vick. And finally, those who continue to come and engage in these conversations with us, both in the classroom and via the wonder of electronic streaming. I am Toni Castillo. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Rose State College, and it is the driving mission of our political science program to engage our campus and larger community civically as well as politically, and certainly that's never as important as it is in an election year. We hope that this panel series has done just that, and with that said, I'd like for the panelists to please briefly introduce themselves.
No pressure, huh? I am Dr. Batchhofer. I know most of you. I'm a history professor here at Rose State College. I've been here since 2007. And I specialize in modern American history, particularly LGBTQ issues and sexuality. I also teach the occasional modern European course, and I generally am the old curmudgeon, I guess, of the division now by default. So. Most of you I've had in class, or I'm currently having in class, so I'm glad that you're here, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carmen Foreman. I work at the Oklahoman. I cover the state capitol and state politics, have done that for almost 4 years at the Oklahoman, but have done that for 9, almost 10 years in general, covering several politics in several different states. And but I was born and raised here and grew up in Norman, so it's good to be back.
My name is Reese Gorman. I'm a politics reporter at the Frontier. I've been there since February. Before then, I worked in Norman for 2 years and covering local government down there. And now I love it. I've been mostly just covering campaigns ever since I've got on in February, whether it be Senate, governor, or any of the other ones. So it's been a great ride. Love it.
Yes, let's share. Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Stacy. You guys know me from all of these panels. Thank you for being here yet again. Dean Castillo forgot to thank herself, so I will very quickly take a point of personal privilege to thank her for her support and also for her willingness to step in and host this panel today in lieu of Dr. Batchhofer. We had to play some, Tetrising today. So, Dr. Emily Stacy, glad to be here, obviously a professor of political science. What a lot of you may not know about me is not only is my PhD in digital media and political communication, but before I got into my PhD program, I was a state capitol reporter with a legislative tracking service, nonpartisan, eCapitol. So for about 5 years, I was the first lady, really. Whenever you opened the Oklahoma State Capitol press room door, it was me. So I have watched a lot of sausage get made. I have covered a lot of Oklahoma campaigns, and I just absolutely love to talk about the intersection of politics and media. A lot of my students know, just particularly social media and revolutions are where my expertise lie in terms of my education. So I'm going to try to infuse a lot of digital talk into today's conversation, but I'll try not to be irritating about it. Okay, thanks for being here.
Thank you all. Let's start with this question. What is the role of the media in American campaigns and elections? And how has the role of the political media transitioned in the digital age?
Well, certainly media, I think when we use that phrase today, we often think of television and certainly social media and digital media, but if we go back in time, if we go back to the period of the colonial era and immediately after, media played a gargantuan role in electioneering. Those of you who are in class with me now in the first part of the U.S. survey know that, for instance, in the first election, the first real election we had in the United States in 1800, that was one of the nastiest elections in American history. And the media at that point that was predominant was newspapers. And the newspapers, of course, were very, very partisan, and they tended to flow to either candidate Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, and it was very salacious for the time, maybe even for today. People called into question John Adams' private White House drinking habits, and they also talked about Thomas Jefferson's alleged sexual relationship with one of his slaves. So this had a profound impact on the way people perceived politics and the way they took advantage and gaining information about candidates. Flash forward to 1828 with Andrew Jackson, the same sort of thing happens, but it's sort of a good thing, I guess, for him. Newspapers and other forms of print media at that point glorified him and talked about what a wonderful, human being he was, and born in the sticks, and became the first non-Massachusettsian, is that a word? Virginian to become president. So there was a lot of emphasis on his personal characters and qualities, and that was used. Moving forward, 1858, you have Lincoln and Douglas in the famous Senate race in Illinois. This was probably electioneering and campaigning at its finest. Two candidates squaring off against each other, answering questions and taking questions directly from the audience. Again, not maybe the kind of media that we would normally think of today, but maybe media in its most pure form, the two of them taking questions from the generalized media, people. Of course, in the modern age, radio and television have made a significant impact on campaignings and elections and just the way people process information. In the 1932 election, this is arguably the first election that we ever hear, presidential election, that we ever hear the president's voice. And it's a nice voice. FDR counsels us to steady the course, steady the ship, that sort of thing. Television, of course, blows the doors off of everything. In 1960, it's arguably the most classic and clear example of the value of television. There was a political debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, and the people who watched the debate on television said that Kennedy won, that he seemed very in control and very, he's a nice-looking man. He just seemed to have the right stuff for TV. People who listened to it on the radio universally thought that Richard Nixon won because he had better control of the issues and so forth. So media has always been something that's with us, and I think in the more modern era, the digital media has changed elections and electioneering quite a bit. I mean, we could talk about the whole issue ad nauseum with Birthergate and Pizzagate and all of that stuff. It has opened up a different style of campaigning, I think, and the truth is not always really the goal. The goal at times, I think, is to get you to identify with a particular candidate in less political ways and more visceral ways. And so that's one of the things I see over time. It's not a new phenomenon, but the media has just evolved over time, and as such, it's had an impact on electioneering. And I'm going to shut up now.
I guess I would say that the media's role in campaigns is, we are sort of a gatekeeper, right? Like whenever a politician says something or outlines a policy proposal, it's sort of the media's role to decide, okay, is this worth covering? Do we write about this and potentially amplify something that is said? Or do we believe that what was said is not accurate, and do we need to do some sort of fact check on it? So, I mean, in a way, the media just sort of plays a role in what goes to the public, and it's different now because candidates can talk directly to the public very easily through Twitter, through their social media pages. They could get on TikTok or whatever and talk directly to you, but for the longest time, the media has played a role in what the public sees and what the public doesn't see. on what candidates are saying, what they're doing, where they're going, all of that. So.
Yeah, so I think the media plays kind of a real essential role in covering the campaigns. I mean, y'all, I think a lot of people wouldn't know what happens on the campaign trail without. Let me just make sure I'm answering the correct question. It's been a while since it was asked. How was the role? Yeah, so I mean, I think it's just. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't know what's going on or what's really going on. I mean, campaigns on social media themselves will put out the best parts of their trips or their stump speeches or whatever. But I mean, in order to know what's really going on in the campaign or the election, it mostly lies on the journalists covering the event and to kind of get out, hey, this is what's happened. Hey, this is where it's at. And I agree with Carmen to this point, to like that there's also fact checking. I mean, I know at the Frontier we fact check every debate that happens just because a lot of times I don't think a lot of times necessarily they're meaning to lie or deceive the people. It just happens. I mean, a lot of times just people say things that aren't true. So that's just the role of the media, is just holding them accountable and also just writing about what happens. I think a lot of campaign reporting is less featurey per se and more just writing about what somebody said on the trail, writing about what actually happened, writing about this, because I think that's the real nitty-grittiness of campaign reporting, is just writing about what happened, how it happened, what was said, what was the reaction, talking to voters, and less so more big, broad stories, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you guys at the Frontier for the fact-checking mission you guys have been on this campaign cycle. It's been incredibly important for the Oklahoma citizens to know what is real and what is not. So thank your organization certainly for that. So I'm going to kind of piggyback, obviously, on what Dr. Batchhofer said. Obviously, the media initially very much a vehicle for leaders, campaigns, and candidates to express their views, for politicians to get approval, right, for their legislative agendas or whatever policy actions they're trying to take. You get sort of the move to investigative journalism, right, with the beginning of the 20th century, the era of muckraking. Bring it into the modern era. The fairness doctrine. I think you get a lot of the new media and this polarization that comes along with the repeal of the fairness doctrine in the late 1980s by Ronald Reagan, and that leads to the rise of predominantly partisan talk radio shows, and that leads to a lot, again, of that fomenting of polarization, particularly in campaigns and elections that we're now seeing in the modern day. Globalization, one of my least favorite topics, but I'm writing a book on deglobalization, which is one of my favorite topics. But globalization, clearly, the proliferation of digital technologies, and particularly the democratization of these technologies, media and culture globally was incredibly important for campaigns, elections, politics, particularly around the world, but definitely at a domestic level. You've got things like satellite television, the fax machine in the 1980s. I know you kids don't know what that is, but it was a thing that screamed at you and like spit paper out that had information on it. And then, of course, the internet. And so the digital age part of this question, it's absolutely transformed everything, particularly in American campaigns and elections. I'll talk about this in relation to question 2, but really the political media landscape has only become more polarized, right? It helps to foment that polarization because the digital media allows us to choose whatever sources we're seeking, right? We call that echo chambers, right? Or selective bias, where we are, I as a conservative am only seeking out news sources like the Wall Street Journal or Drudge Report that are patting me on the back for my pre-established beliefs and opinions. And so that has only helped to really create this environment now politically where we unfortunately continue to just kind of throw poo at each other as opposed to actually, come to a consensus, which is what your founding fathers believed in. So lots of polarization, lots of you guys being clickbait because it's way more fun to see what Hillary Clinton's body count is today rather than read her healthcare policy. Lots of mis and disinformation. And so that makes what Reese and Carmen do way more important because, again, it is extraordinarily difficult to know what is and what is not reality and what is the truth, and then to make the best political decisions for yourself based on that reality. So I'll get off my soapbox for now.
Thank you. Next question, has the internet made campaigning easier for candidates and politicians or harder? And connected with that, has the availability of information and access made participation easier for citizens?
Thank you. Well, I would say in relation to candidates, it's made it both easier and harder, which I know is a cop-out, and you're welcome. But let me explain. I think in the pre-1970, pre-1960 mindset, campaigning was usually more face-to-face. It was door-to-door. It was handshaking, public debates on television. And I'm not saying that they were easier. It was more difficult, I think, to lie. I'm just going to be very blunt with you. It was more difficult to obfuscate the truth. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the people covering the news were people like Carmen and Reese. They were the Fourth Estate. They still are, but I mean, at that point, the Fourth Estate was held in very, very high esteem, and rightly so. They were fact checkers. They were information gurus. They gave us, in so many ways, sometimes the only information we would have about a political candidate or a particular race. And I think now the message is so much easier to get out. And as Carmen suggested, this idea that the candidate can talk directly to you in these platforms has changed the nature of campaigning. There's not really a great deal of, honestly, I don't think there's a great deal of penalty for not telling the truth or for distorting the truth in such a way that it is decidedly untruthful for political gain. But there's also, it appeals, I think, tries to appeal to younger voters because of the media, the nature of media, how slick it is and how easily it can be remembered. So I do think it's a little bit easier for people to get their message out using modern media techniques, but at the same time, it's not as easy to refute things that aren't true. Once that statement has been made or that information is out in Never Never Land, it's never going away. So even if it's pulled, someone's going to find it, someone's going to repost it, it will be around forever. And so that, I think, is one of the issues for candidates. As far as voters, I think clearly you run into the danger of analysis paralysis. You are inundated with information. Is it good? Is it bad? As Dr. Stacy was discussing earlier, you have the whole confirmation bias thing going, and thank you so much for sending me more information that I already believed in anyway. And so I think at times we're all busy and life is very hectic, and in that kind of environment, we maybe tend to try and go for the easiest path of finding information and processing it, and sometimes that information may not always be the best information. And for me, it's just kind of a personal statement. I sometimes wonder how the traditional pillars of American polling will react to all of this, because you conduct a poll and it's on CNN or it's on Fox or wherever it happens to be, and someone sees that as a voter. Does that change their behavior? Do they say, well, I might as well not vote because so-and-so is up by 60%, I'll just stay home? It may not impact that particular race, but is it going to impact the other 5 or 10 races that are on the ballot that you're not participating in? So to me, the modern media is kind of a blessing and a curse in terms of its ability for people to hear messages and for candidates and other politicos to offer messages. So anyway.
Blessing and a curse is a good way of putting it. I definitely think like the flow of information, it's insane now with the internet, right? You can find information all over the place, and I think for the most part, most people don't quite know where to look. They're just, okay, let's take for an example, let's say there's a presidential race and then there's a debate, and the two candidates leading for president have a debate. Well, there's going to be approximately at least hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on the internet about what was said in the debate, what each candidate said, what was truthful, what was not. And you are expected to go out there and parse through all of that to find what you think is accurate information. And I think that's becoming increasingly difficult because and I'm going to use this term not like our former president used it, but there is fake news out there. Like there is. I mean, there are partisan news outlets that are trying to write about things or report on things in a way that is beneficial to them or, skews facts. And it's becoming harder and harder to find what is straight down the middle or what is just accurate information about where a candidate stands on their policies. I also think, it just, the internet age, the digital age makes it easier to put misinformation out there. I mean, I could tweet something on my Twitter account right now that I know is not true. And at least, I think I have not as many followers as Reese, but I have thousands of Twitter followers. You assume a fraction of those people would see it. At least some of those people would believe it. And let's say maybe at least one or two tell a friend. Some retweet it, some pass it along, and then it's, that misinformation just spreads like wildfire, and then there's no way to contain it. And we're at a point where, the number of journalists out there are shrinking, and misinformation is growing, and there's just simply not enough journalists to combat the misinformation.
Yeah, and I think it personally, for campaigns, I think it's made it easier for campaigns to campaigns. I think it makes it harder for the voters, harder for me and Carmen, but I think for campaigns, it makes it significantly easier. For journalists, I think the amount of information that's put out is kind of just that flow, like drinking out of a fire hydrant almost, does make it harder in a sense, but it's easier for us to disseminate information to people. But like Carmen said, you got to be very careful what you put out. I mean, actually, Carmen, so I'm only 23, so I was whenever I was out on Twitter, it was very much like, I was still in college and just graduated, and I was still kind of idiotic, and I thought I could tweet like funny stuff, or people just know I'm joking, because I just didn't think that my Twitter held any weight. And then I actually, in a conversation with Carmen, when she was like, I just put out my stories and stuff like that, and I was like, that's probably a smart thing to do. I was like, people could read my stuff and be like, man, I didn't know this was happening, when in reality I just meant it as a joke or whatever. So I've really kind of toned down that, where I mostly just tweet solely factual information. I don't tweet anything personal. I don't tweet anything like that. And in that sense, it's made it easier, because it is, like she said, there's a lot of false information that's out on Twitter. It's not just from one side; it's from both sides. I know Carmen and I will send each other tweets about stuff that just makes us so mad, and it doesn't matter. It's a cross-party line, just people just spreading just stupid stuff, and that does make our job a lot harder, because anyone with a Twitter account can act as a journalist now. When in reality you're just a partisan hack. And that makes it difficult. I mean, it does, because people now they're able to get information that sounds good to them and not necessarily what is factual, and which sucks, because people go live in their echo chamber. And I know I've complained about this before, but it's really people on both sides get mad when you write something that doesn't make them look good. And it's really annoying, because I'm like, my job is not to make the left look good. It's not to make the right look good. It's just report the information. So if I report something that makes a Democratic candidate look bad, people on the left will get mad, because and same with people on the right, because both sides are both so used to living in this echo chamber where they could just hear what they want to hear, never have to hear anything bad, and just can always have their minds reaffirmed. And so that part does make our jobs a lot easier. But as far as it goes for campaigns, that echo chamber helps, because they're able to, their voters can believe whatever they want them to believe. They're able to just, you put something out there, like, oh my God, they'll circulate in these circles. And so for them, it makes it easier, because they don't have any competing information, because these people can live in echo chambers. But as far as voters, I think it's hard, because it's very hard to disseminate from what's factual, what's not.
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously, I called you clickbait earlier, so clearly I totally agree with that. So from a candidate standpoint, and the students who have had my government class know that I like to focus on Obama and Trump. So Barack Obama was really the first internet-based American presidential candidate that we had. We can fight about Howard Dean and his use of, rudimentary, digital tools back in 2004, and then he did the cowboy away, yeah, and then just dropped off the face of the earth. But really, Obama was the first one to use crowdfunding, to use SMS or text message capabilities, to use the internet, email blast, et cetera, YouTube videos. My God, you remember the chick who dressed up in a bikini and was singing, about Obama on YouTube was huge in 2007, 2008. So really, Obama was the first to really hit folks where they lived, right? And again, there's no coincidence that in 2008 you had the largest voter turnout of 18 to 25, really 18 to 30-year-olds, because as a candidate, presidential candidate, he again hit us where we were now living, which was online. And so if we credit Obama with being sort of the internet-driven candidate and changing the landscape, after 2008, after that campaign, you as a candidate really for president, but it trickled eventually down to the state and local level, you had to have some sort of social media presence, internet presence. I'm a millennial. I just died when Reese mentioned that he was 23, just really died inside for a second. But as an elder millennial, I even find it sus if a candidate for office does not have some sort of digital presence. It is, you've got something in your closet if you're not online. So if we credit Obama with really being that candidate who propelled the internet and made it a mainstay of American campaigns, then you have to talk about Donald Trump and his use of social media throughout the candidacy, particularly throughout the primary. If we really talk about the 2016 primary, that man used very little money in his primary run because, of course, he came down the golden escalator, said some pretty salacious stuff. So the broadcast media followed him around like a puppy dog, right, to see whatever he was going to say next. Covered rallies, covered press briefings whenever the administration started in ways that had not been done before because he was just kind of a different candidate and different president. But in terms of his use of social media, you had to change laws. The National Archives and the Library of Congress, right? Because this man, as your official president, was still using his @real Donald Trump account on Twitter, dude. He was making in some places on Twitter foreign policy statements. At certain points during that administration, we could have gone to war with a couple of different countries via Twitter if we were taking just what he was saying via social media at face value, which your Library of Congress decided those things have to be archived as presidential records. So that is a complete just overhaul of the way in which not just a candidate, but a presidential administration, the executive office, is able to utilize your new media for whatever fits their agenda. So it makes it incredibly, as everybody has said, incredibly easy for candidates and your political leaders to get their own messages out there and kind of reinforce those things to you. But again, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for us because there is often so much conflicting information, or we're just being inundated with so much information all the time. It is extremely hard to parse what is real, what's not real, what is important to me and what's not important to me. And I think that is maybe the more important part of this conversation, right? If I'm getting all of this information as a citizen, as a voter, what is it that is going to drive me to the voting booth? What's going to drive me to action? And maybe all of this information that I'm getting is making me more apathetic. It's just overwhelming me, and I can't make a good decision for myself. So in that respect, I think it is more difficult, particularly for citizens of a democracy, because we have a free press, yay! And we are able to have voices like both Carmen and Reese in terms of investigative journalism. So as they said, bang on the table for a moment. If the news source that you are consulting, if it is telling you how you should vote at the end of consuming it, or what your opinion on policy is, you need to seek a new news source. Reese pointed out perfectly. They are there. The journalists are there not to pat your elected leaders on their backs or tell your government that they're doing a wonderful job. They're there to give you information, news and information, facts that you then, as hopefully critically thinking human beings, then put into your own moral, religious, political, whatever context that is, and then make the best decisions for yourself. So I hope that we can get back to I don't know, being better consumers of the media as citizens, right? One of my favorite quotes, and it'll probably go on my gravestone, is that the burden of a democracy is on you and I, right? The burden of a democracy is on you as I as democratic citizens to be well informed and to make the best political decisions for the continuity of our democracy, right? If you want an easy government, maybe Russia is good for you because they'll tell you what the news is today and what, politics is, and they'll tell you who's going to win the presidential race. But even before you get to the ballot box. So please keep that in mind. Be good consumers, right? I'm getting into my mom mode, so I'll stop now. But please be good consumers of your news media. If it sounds like BS, it's probably BS. Snopes it, right? There, do your research. The burden is on you, unfortunately. Okay, I'm done.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stacy and other panelists. That's really a great lead into the next question, which is, what obligations do the media have to citizens in a democratic society?
Wow. I think, and the way I conceive of this is that there are two kinds of journalists, and I don't mean any disrespect at all to anyone who engages in any form of journalism, but I think clearly there are news journalists and there are media journalists. And my friends up here on the Fourth Estate, I classify them as news journalists, and they have traditionally had a set of ethics that transcend personal agendas, hopefully, and they report the news. They try and find information, and they make that news and information as available to us as easily and in an accessible way as possible. And I'll give you a good example of this. They're not, traditionally they don't focus on salacious details and which person is sleeping with which person and all of that stuff. In the 1930s, most Americans did not realize that Franklin Roosevelt was unable to walk without help, and that he used a wheelchair most of the time because the media, the news media that were there, refused to print that. They refused to talk about it. They thought it was beneath their station. They were there to talk about the news. What is he talking about? What is he saying? And that would not happen today, I think, in some cases. So standards for news and journalists are a bit different. Now, when we get into what I would call news journalists, those folks that have their own shows on some of these cable networks and otherwise interpret and filter the news for you, we have to remember that they are beholden to sponsors. They are beholden to the people, their editors and folks who are higher up the chain, and not always in a good way. An editor, an ideal editor, I would think, is someone who gives you a lot of lead room, a lot of leg room, but when you maybe are moving a little bit too far one way or the other, they pull you back and say, perhaps we should, fill in the blank. And it's not necessarily so. In this modern day of, as Dr. Stacy was talking about, Donald Trump's a prime example of this. If you don't do the right thing, if you don't say the right thing, you're not going to get president time. He's not going to come on your show. He's not going to give you the quote. He's going to make fun of you. And people who follow him are going to denigrate what you say, what you represent, and how you present yourself to the world. So in a way, this becomes very much the politics of personality in a very, very negative and nefarious way. People will cease to listen to you. People will cease to provide money for your show, for advertisements, and there you go. So it's a different world, I think, between the typical Fourth Estate folks who are genuinely concerned with providing as much clear news and information as possible, and the more entertainment-minded groups that you would see in some of these cable news programs and things. But it's up to us. Dr. Stacy makes a great point. It's kind of up to us to be the arbiters of that and to say, well, I don't know if I believe that, or I think that might be a little bit too good to be true, and maybe I should investigate that more. It's a shame, but I think that if you really want to be informed and make good decisions, you have to weed out the stuff that is just noise, that's trying to make you feel a certain way about something rather than informing you about events.
Yeah, so I think our role is pretty simple. Our job as journalists is to inform the public. We're supposed to give you all the information, or at least as much information as we can, so that when you walk into a voting booth, you can feel confident in making your decision of who to vote for. That's not me saying, okay, we're going to tell you how to vote. because that shouldn't be our job, but we should make sure you know who the candidates are, what they're saying, where they stand on key issues, so that you can be an informed electorate. And then also, just beyond the campaign season, holding elected officials accountable. Once they get into office, are they doing what they said they would do? How are they spending your money? Things like that.
I agree. Our job is not to tell you how or what to think. It's just to give you the information to think for yourselves. I mean, it's just to give you information that can help inform your decision. You guys think for yourselves. I think a lot of people have gotten there's. I mean, and kind of like what he said. I think there is a sect of quote unquote journalism that people want to tell you kind of how to think or what to think and all that. But I don't see that as our job. I see it as our job is to just give y'all information and and to decide how to think for yourselves. I think that's ultimately the role of a journalist. And I agree with Carmen too about how during the campaign season, just constantly giving information. I mean, it's like an information, like I said, drinking out a fire hydrant, just constantly just turning out information more and more about what they say, what they do, just so the public can read and really take in. Because the public can't travel to every event with the governor or with his opponent, but it's our job to do that. It's our job to follow them around and to tell people what's going on, and also holding them accountable. I know. I forgot your name. I'm sorry. Harry? Eric? Aaron. I'm sorry. Aaron. I know Aaron.
We'll get there.
I know Aaron mentioned that a lot of times it's elected official, but hey, if you don't do this, say this or this, we won't give you information. And I think that's maybe the public perception of it, but a lot of times the media is an easy scapegoat, but a lot of times they want to talk to us. They might ridicule us. Like I've written stories that I can guarantee you that both candidates do not like, but both candidates also won't pass up an opportunity if I'm there to talk to me. Like, especially if I'm the only journalist there, like they want to talk to the media. They'll probably be like, that was a terrible story. I've never talked to them, but the second they have the opportunity to, they're going to talk to you. They want to. So I think they might ridicule you publicly. They might get mad. They might say, oh, I'm never doing this unless you do this, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, we can do our job without them talking to us, and that's just the facts of the matter. But a lot of times it's harder for them to do their job without talking to us, because how else is anybody going to know? People, I guarantee you, if say Governor Stitt sends out a tweet about something he did, a few people might see that, but more people will know if it's on TV news, if it's in the newspaper, or if it's online. More people will know that than see a tweet or a Facebook post. So I think ultimately, while they might talk, I mean, even Donald Trump, he'd still talk to all the reporters that he demonized all the time. I mean, I think it's just how life is. They like to talk and talk a big game, but in the end of the day, they're going to talk to you. I mean, unless you do something terribly out of pocket, but if you just write a story that makes them look bad, but it's a fair story, they're still going to talk to you. That's what I've learned anyways.
So I'm going to use my time, because this is just another soapbox moment for me, then I'm going to regurgitate what I just said. So I want to ask you a mild question, my two reporter friends. Has there been a story during this campaign season that has caused that kind of kerfuffle, where you have been disowned by Atchison? How do you say her name? Carly? The governor, is it Atchison? Yeah. So any good investigative or any stories that you put out that caused any sort of kerfuffles?
So, we write what we write, and if we think the public deserves to know it, and there may be backlash, but, as long as we got the facts straight, we're fine. Yeah. So not about the governor. I wrote a story over the summer about Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister. She's running as a Democrat for governor. Her husband, while she switched parties to become a Democrat, her husband remained a registered Republican. So that means in the primary election, we have closed primaries, so her own husband could not vote for her in the election. Whether that's earth-shattering news or not, I mean, that's for you guys to decide. But my editors and I had conversations about, well, is this worth writing about? And in our minds, if a candidate couldn't even get her own husband to vote for her, how can she be asking the public to vote for her? So we put it out there. We wrote a story. Hoffmeister's campaign folks and staffers just eviscerated it on Twitter, on Facebook, on just complaints all around. There were complaints that, there were like complaints about just sexism, basically, that we're only writing about this. How could a woman and a man, how could a woman have a different voting record than her husband? And it's like, well, this story was written by a female reporter, so obviously who is married and votes differently from her husband. So that wasn't the point. But no, I don't think it's been an issue since. I would say candidates get mad about these things, or their staff gets mad about these things, and maybe they're mad for a day or two, and then it blows over. Reese, you have a good example?
Not really from the campaign per se. I think my Hoffmeister abortion story was probably one that they didn't like. She didn't really take a stance on abortion or anything like that. And a lot of times, though, the campaign will get upset. But a lot of times it's the supporters that get the most upset. And I don't know, that's my experience. I don't know if you can attest as well. Of both sides. And then the other thing too, I think the reason Carmen and I probably have more Hoffmeister examples is because we've covered STIT for so long. Basically there's no other, we know where he stands on things. I wrote the Swadley story, which I know they didn't like. I wrote the gear funding story, which they didn't like. They really tried. But at the end of the day, if they didn't, it's a fair story. It's a fair, accurate story, and they still talk to me. I know, they probably hate that I wrote the story, but they're still going to talk to me. And I still talk to both campaigns on a daily basis. I'll give them a call, hey, where are you going to be today? What's the plan? What are y'all doing? Blah, blah. Y'all got any ads coming out? It's just, they'll happily talk to me. I still got invited to the watch parties, even though they might not have liked some of the stories I wrote about them. It's just, they'll always, like I said before, they'll always talk they're like, oh, well, we're going to cut off your access. I'm like, okay, do it. It's going to hurt you more than it hurts me. And in the end of the day, no one's ever actually threatened to cut off the access, but they definitely have gotten upset at stories. But I think that it's fine. It's just the role of us is we're not to make people happy. Journalism is printing what other people don't, and everything else is PR. So that's my opinion on the matter.
Thank you. Sorry to hijack the panel. I just was curious, desperately curious.
And actually, that leads into this next question, which is going to push for a little more specificity. Is the media biased towards one political party or another in terms of coverage?
Wow.
It's a loaded question.
Maybe I should. No. I think clearly, and again, we're using the term media rather broadly here, and I will pick on the Daily Oklahoman for just a moment because I know, wow, my bad. But seriously, that newspaper has been the state's newspaper since the turn of the century, and by that I mean the turn of the 19th century, more or less. And so it has always had it has a long track record, obviously, of covering political events, and those who are old with gray hair like me will tell you that the Oklahoman has not always been the most detached observer of political events in Oklahoma, and the views, the editorial views that were exhibited and given to the public tended to mirror those of the ownership of the newspaper. At one point, they were putting editorials on the front page of the newspaper, which is probably one of the most uncouth things I think you could do. However, having said that, the Oklahoma now is much, much better. It is much more readable. I now subscribe to it again, actually, and it's light years ahead of where it was. But my point there is just simply that, of course, there is bias in media. I think there's less bias in our Fourth Estate friends here because they generally look to just report the news and to follow candidates and hold their feet to the fire and try and get information for us. And when you compare that to what goes on in the more entertainment-minded parts of the media world, with you folks, the talking heads, as I call them, they have their own shows and whatnot. That's not news. Those folks are trying to change your mind about something, and whether that's related to the people who sponsor their shows or their own particular political views and outlooks on things, I don't know, maybe both. But I think clearly in the more entertainment side of the media, there's definitely a bias, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you have to fall for it. You can watch some of that stuff, I think, maybe, and get some fresh ideas or maybe fresh takes. But I would not rely on what Anderson Cooper or Sean Hannity tell you in terms of what you should be doing in the voting box, frankly. But there you go.
Yeah, I would agree with everything he just said. Even the stuff about the Oklahoman, we used to be a very conservative newspaper. As you can tell, I'm pretty young, so I didn't really work there at that time. We've definitely swung more to the left, but I would say nowadays, I don't see that largely affecting our news coverage. As for whether the media is biased, it depends who you ask. So there's a lot of politicians, obviously, that'll say this news outlet or that news outlet is biased. I have a good example. A couple weeks ago, one of the local TV stations, KFOR, had a 10-minute long story about how the governor was building a new residence on his property, and it was being privately funded, as most renovations at the governor's mansion are privately funded. Personally, I didn't think the story had all the context it probably needed, but people on the left said, oh, Governor Stitt is a monster because, he's privately funding $6 million for a new governor's mansion when he already has a governor's mansion that he doesn't live in. And then it just so happened that the next day after that story ran on TV, I happened to be at a campaign breakfast with the governor. And, he sits down at the table. There's maybe a dozen Republicans there, and the story comes up, and they all just laugh about it. And Governor Stitt shrugs it off as, quote, a hit piece, and his conservative friends are all laughing about this part of the story or that part of the story. And, so when I say that, is the media biased, it depends who you ask. Well, I bet if we lined up 10 different politicians here and we asked them to review all the news outlets in the state, they would give you different answers based on their political leanings and which ones have given them favorable coverage. And so, Governor Stitt might say KFOR is really biased, but, Joy Hoffmeister might say, I don't know, the Oklahoman's really biased. Things like that, so.
I agree 100%. I think that it really does depend on who you ask. Everyone has their own internal biases, every journalist. We're all people. But the world of the journalist is putting that aside. And that's something I really try, and Carmen tries really hard to do too, is put aside those biases and cover everyone equally as if you would anybody else. And I know some people, I do vote. I know personally some reporters that don't vote because they don't want to have that bias in their head. And I believe that I can cover something very objectively and still vote on the matter. But that's me. I know some people that just don't vote at all. But I do think, and the thing that makes me mad is that people associate local media with national media, which national media is definitely biased. I think we see a lot. Just looking at the coverage of the stuff that gets covered and the stuff that doesn't get covered, it's very much skewed to the left. There is a national media bias for sure. And I think that's just accurate to say, but I think a lot of the people then put that onto local media, which in reality, I don't care. I genuinely just am if someone screws up, I'm going to cover you just like I would anyone else. I'm going to cover the campaign just like I would anything else. And I think that is something that, I hate it when national media comes into Oklahoma. And not all outlets, some do a good job, but when they parachute in, I remember the CNN story, they're in Miami, Oklahoma. He walks in, he's like, I'm in Miami, Oklahoma. And I was like, first of all, shut up. And he goes into this diner, and he just holds up, he's like, I'm with CNN, who here's getting the vaccine? I'm like, you're in Miami, Oklahoma. No, of course. And he's like, nobody here's getting the vaccine? And I was like, dude, you choose one of the most rural conservative parts. Why are you embarrassed? They do it just to make us look stupid, Oklahomans. And that makes me mad, because then everyone associates media with that one bozo at CNN, who then, and I think that stuff is very much idiotic, and I hate it. But I think that's just part of the role of the journalist. I think forever journalists have been accused of being biased one way or the other. I think it's just something that you have to live with. And once again, I mean, a lot of it's for show. A lot of the stuff that candidates and people throw at journalists is for show. I mean, literally, like Carmen said, two different candidates can say the same, can say, like, Hofmeister can be like, oh, the Oklahoman's biased, and then Stick can be the same thing, like, oh, the Oklahoman's a liberal media outlet. That means you're doing your job. You're just, I've been called a right-wing reporter, I've been called a liberal hack. Like, it just is, you just gotta get used to it.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that was just said. You made me think about the more recent example of the national news media coming in and kind of criticizing one of Oklahoma's finest, one Trey Savage, from non-doc, right, for the debate performance, right? So there was that moment where Joy Hofmeister noted how Oklahoma's violent crime rate was higher than in New York and California. And so the national news media kind of made it seem as if Trace was laughing at that statistic with Kevin Stitt, and it was really kind of a gross misinterpretation of what was actually going on that stage. So yeah, I will agree mildly with the just kind of knowing how unfortunately the national media does cover Oklahoma. It makes us look like we're not the greatest human beings. However, I will push back just a little bit on the overall media bias comment, right? Research shows, plenty of academic research over time has shown, right, that there is not, and we hear more often than not, that there's a liberal bias within the news media, and academic research, again, time after time shows that, yes, while more journalists and academics happen to be registered, Democrat, it does not translate into that bias in our teaching or in the reporting of the news. So I do want to kind of push back on that. But of course, in today's news media, you've got to be careful consumers of what it is, that you're taking in. If you're reading an op-ed, expect for that to be colored, right, with someone's opinion. If you're watching the big three, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, know that those are geared towards niche audiences. They are selling those stories to a certain demographic of human beings, right? And so again, it comes down to us. It is always going to come down to us for me. But generally speaking, is the media biased? No, academic research shows that it's not. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, Reese brought this up a little bit when he talked about how a lot of this was just for show. So if that is the case, and what Dr. Stacy just went through is the case, then what advice does each of you have for citizens who want to be better consumers of news and information?
Me and Carmen?
Well, I was looking at Dr. Batchhofer first.
She's going to hit me in the head with this if I didn't respond. I think I would point to a couple of things. Number one, Dr. Stacy's point that you should be aware of the news media outlets and where they get their news and the style and the editorial habits. I think always consult multiple media outlets and maybe a print culture. I know print culture is not always in style, maybe, but I would have at least one good newspaper that you read on a daily or weekly basis. And then if you want to watch some of that other stuff and talking heads, that's fine, but just be aware of who they are and what they're trying to do, and you'll be fine. I would also say, and maybe this is the old man coming out in me, but don't ever reshare or retweet anything. More than likely, if it came to you for a reason, and it has a lot to do with what you're looking at. And first of all, I will say this, I don't care. And I don't know that the people you're sending it to really care. But it's an example of that kind of confirmation bias and the idea that you are getting material that corresponds to material that you've looked at in the past. So be wary of that kind of thing. Always, I'm a historian, man, come on, check the sources. What kind of material are they basing their arguments on? Are they using unnamed sources, or are they putting people on Front Street? Are they really putting good, accurate information out there from credible sources? And then finally, and this is, I think, gone out of style a little bit, we should all do, and I put myself in this category, we should all do a better job of acknowledging that the other side is not Satan. We may disagree with them, but at times they have good ideas. Not very often. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, I mean, be open to listening to the other side and questioning what you believe about a particular issue. I would say that their truth exists. It does. It's hard to find, but it exists. Fairness and generosity are still kind of cool. And if not, we need to bring them back and make them cool. And then finally, knowledge is power. Good knowledge is power. So that's the end.
Don't just read the news you see on social media. Get off Facebook. If you're only getting your news from Facebook, you're doing it wrong. Same for Twitter. I think the advice to look at multiple news outlets on, potentially the same topic, could be a great way to determine, okay, well, I like what non-doc is writing about the governor's race, but let's see what the Tulsa World is writing about the governor's race. They may have a different take. You might like their feel a bit better, but, again, to avoid ending up in an echo chamber, I think it helps to read multiple sources of news. And then, don't just read what the national news outlets put out. I mean, local news is very important too. You all are Oklahomans, temporarily or permanently, and you live here, you should read the local news or watch the local TV news, just to know what's going on in your backyard.
Yeah, 100%. I would say read everything. Don't put something down because you see, oh, I heard this source is bad, or I heard this is, just read everything. And then decide for yourself, in my opinion. Don't disregard a story because of where it comes from, but also don't just read the things that align with your views. Don't just read, just stuff that you think, oh, this seems interesting. And also, read the story. Don't just read the headline. That's the thing that, read the story. I get so many people mad all the time because they'll be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, did you actually, read it? I'm trying not to cuss right now, but, did you actually read the story? Read the story. Don't just read the headline. Go inside, actually read it. And I think that will then fix a lot because, so read the story. Don't just read the headline. Get out of the echo chamber on social media. Go to the websites of the news. Just go to the website. Sign up for newsletters. Read. And again, and the other side is not Satan, depending on whatever side you're on. It's they might disagree with you. They might have terrible views. But they're not terrible. Everyone, you just got to realize, they believe the way they believe for a reason, and just sit down and talk to them. Understand where they're coming from, and that it's not like you said, they're not Satan. They're not they don't deserve to die. Just actually sit and understand where people are coming from, because also, would you want to be treated that way? That's the kind of how I look at it too. When I'm going into a story and I'm if I automatically blocked off, I'm not talking to this sect of people, that's a whole reader base that I'm going to be alienating. That's not going to be getting my news. And so just talk to people. Don't judge people just on first glance. Just talk, hear their stories, and don't just read the headline, read the news, and get out of the echo chamber.
Yeah, I second all of that. And for my IR kids in the room, if you are reading a story that is happening on a global issue, dear Lord, please get it from the BBC or the Economist, right? Please get it from an international news source. We do a terrible job in the Western news media of covering a lot of international news stories. The Rwandan genocide is a really good example from whenever you kids didn't exist in the mid to late 1990s. Americans did not know about that genocide until it was too late. So please consult international media sources for international news. Please. And then, I think it is really important. State and local media, capital core media, has been a dwindling breed of journalism in America, right? We are seeing the corporatization, right, professionalization, the Sinclair broadcasting groups, et cetera, these national media organizations that are coming in and eating up these smaller locally owned news stations, and so we're getting this kind of homogenized news source, news stories that are being covered as if they were, were, from your community, from your neighborhood, and that is really unfortunate. So please do seek out, sources like the Frontier or Non-Doc. These are really wonderful news sources, the Oklahoman as well. To keep things in mind and keep it in perspective, right? Make sure that it is not telling you your source of news, if it's radio, social media, whatever it is that you're consuming, make sure that it is not telling you how to vote, what your opinion is, whatever the policy solution should be, et cetera. That is for you to decide. No one should be spoon feeding you your opinion or how you should vote, regardless of whether you really like Rachel Maddow or not. She should not be the arbiter of what you're doing here on the ground in Oklahoma. So please make sure that you are using, your brain and such. We are trying to make you critically thinking human beings here at Rose State College, and hopefully voting and being civically minded is part of that. And being good consumers of the news is one of the first steps in being a well-informed citizen and then making those good political decisions for yourself. So don't be clickbait, children. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Okay, we're going to open this up to questions from the audience, but while I'm coming down with the microphone, let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you so much. Questions?
It's always weirder with a mic. So you all almost answered my question, but so, and sorry if this is long-winded. I think that's the only way I know how to ask a question. So there's this great docuseries about the Murdoch family. So spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it. So they almost make and I don't know if they would say that they're trying to do this, but it seems like they make this like correlation between Trump's relationship and Robert Murdoch's relationship, and basically make this correlation between that and the reason why he got elected. So just a little bit further background, like Trump ends up, becoming friends with Robert Murdoch, who owns Fox News. And he ends up, going on there like once a week, talking about his policies and politics, even before he's even running for president. So my question is, to what degree, if any, does that happen at the state level?
There are. There's radio stations that are political partisan and all that. I don't think at our level, truly, I don't think we get I don't think we do that at all. Personally speaking, I don't want to give one person a bunch of airtime if they're not already a candidate. Personally, I don't get paid enough to cover anything else but the people that are already elected or running for office. I'm not gonna go out of my way for somebody. Personally, so that definitely, I think maybe radio stations, they might help out their friends more so because there are more partisan-leaning radio stations. But as far as a journalist standpoint, I don't think that happens.
All I can think of, at the state level, is there's a conservative think tank called OCPA, and they have their own news sort of site. News that's very conservative leaning and all of that, and they kind of write about things in a way that benefits them. But I guess the thing I would say to that is, most news outlets are businesses, right? And so Rupert Murdoch thought it would be good for his business if Trump got elected. And he was right. He was right. And, other news, I'm not saying that other news outlets make that same calculation, but other news outlets still have to make money to survive. So that it adds a unique layer into journalism and how journalism gets done.
What other questions?
With the speed of the modern news cycle, how much does that impact or challenge journalists in being able to research or tell for a new story?
The speed affects a lot.
All the time.
Man, there's a lot of I think it's gotten to the point, I know Carmen could probably agree, where being first is so important in news. Like, it's to the point where, like, sometimes if someone gets a news story out before you, your boss just could be like, I just don't even write about it. So, and I think there is that side of things, especially on the campaign political side of things, where stuff is always happening. I think Twitter is really kind of, like, I'm working like 24/7. Like, I'm always on, just because you never know, like, people texting me, emailing me, like, getting stuff out. I'll break a lot of news on Twitter instead of in my stories, just because it's so much quicker and all that. But investigative pieces, I think, you do have more time to kind of really dig in, but also think it's hindered by also, luckily I work at an outlet that allows me to take time to work on a long story like that, because I don't have to do so much of the daily news coverage, which I'm very, very grateful for. But I know there's a lot of stuff that I think it does hurt the research somewhat, just because you are just constantly going.
Yeah, I think it dumbs down policy discussions. So, like, I cover the state capitol, so all the things that come out of the legislature, and I'm thinking of a really good example during their special session a couple months ago, weeks ago, I've lost track of time. There was a bill that had to do with the OU Children's Hospital, and it basically tied $100 million of federal stimulus money to basically OU Children's and OU Health wouldn't get the money unless OU Children's stopped performing certain gender-affirming care. So what is gender-affirming care, and how do you look into what exactly OU Health is doing when you have to turn around a story in 4 hours from now, and you have all these lawmakers on the right saying, oh, well, I'm not going to say this politely, I guess, but they're chopping off children's genitals over there. That's what people were saying. And, logic would suggest that's probably not happening. And OU Health has said, that's not happening. But at the time, OU Health was being very quiet. They weren't saying much about their program. I understand why. They were kind of feeling under attack as lawmakers are, making these big policy decisions. But I guess my point is, having to research all of that on a very tight deadline, it may not be the best research I'm ever going to do of my life. And, my story might suffer from it, and my readers might suffer from it because I had such a tight deadline. But at that point, you just get the news out. But to some extent, the news industry has always been that way. It's always, you get a scoop, you write it as quick as you can, you get it out as soon as possible.
And then add more research later and stuff like that. So.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, then I'll ask the last one, if the panelists don't mind. And that question is, I'm just particularly interested in how big data and dark money influence campaigns. Do you have any thoughts on those in our current elections going on in Oklahoma?
I'll go real fast, and I do have to head out right after this answer. I got to do some radio show, but dark money is freaking insane. The amount of money being spent in this race is absolutely crazy. And I don't think it's non-objective to mention that over $25 million in outside money being spent is crazy. It is. It's a lot of money. And I've read about it, Carmen's written about it, and it's in every race now. CD2, there was, they spent more money than both candidates combined, and that's also happening in this race too. But over in CD2, the dark money spent in the primary, not even in the general, because to be fair, the general doesn't matter over there, so it's just the primary. They spent $10 million in dark money, and the candidates only spent $3.4 million combined. Which I was like, that's insane. So outside interests are now the main funders, so you really of elections. It's also happened in the governor's race. We're seeing all the dark money in support of Hoffmeister and attacking Stitt. It's up to, I know Stitt will, in his campaign, will probably say over 50 million. I've only personally been able to find 25 million of dark money. I don't have all the resources they have, but personally I've found 25 million. It still is a lot of money when the candidates themselves, I think, have only spent combined, 10 million maybe, give or take. And It's wild. It is freaking insane, and it's a lot of stuff to take in because you can't track it either. You can't know where it's coming from, and it's kind of insane. So
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, I think it's I think it's a damn shame that we have so much dark money. I think it's a shame that dark money is allowed. Unless probably it would take action on the federal level to stop that. But journalists advocate for transparency in all areas of government. Whether it's the governor should be transparent about, how he's running his office, or the legislature should be transparent about how they're spending taxpayer dollars. Campaigns should be transparent, and who is spending money to influence your vote should be transparent. Is anything going to change anytime soon? Probably not. But you, as consumers of news, as consumers of media, I'm sure that you see things trying to influence you in the governor's race or in other campaigns, and you just have to know and have to think critically about it. Who is funding this? Who could be behind this? Even if they don't tell you.
it's crazy. Like, I know it's freaking insane. It's crazy. So.
Well, on that note, I know all four of you could have been a dozen other places right now. So thank you for your generosity with your time. The audience, thank you again. Appreciate it.